Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
This week on Heroic Media, surrogacy is in the news again this week as the life of another baby with Down syndrome is threatened.
A U.S. fertility clinic tests the health of teens born through a controversial in vitro fertilization technique.
Medicare may cover end-of-life discussions for millions of Americans as early as next year.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we discuss news headlines that deal with issues of family and marriage and life. And the reason that we focus on those is that those issues are absolutely foundational. They're just so fundamental to society that everything else depends on them.
Absolutely, and a lot of times we'll cover stories that revolve around abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly. So Patrick, what's our first story for today?
All right, in our first story, a third occurrence of a surrogate mother being asked to abort her child has been reported recently. The surrogate mother in this case, her baby was discovered to have Down syndrome and also was diagnosed with cystic hygroma. And so this is just the third story in a very recent string of events where we hear about these scenarios where there's a surrogate mother and the future parents are like, we want that baby to be aborted. And so we covered a story recently with Gammy, who was a little baby boy, was a twin. They decided to keep the girl, but abort the boy. They wanted to abort the boy, so the mother was like, I'm not going to abort this baby. You know, this baby's a part of me. Of course, there's so many things that we could talk about regarding this topic, but what were your first impressions with this story?
Well, it's interesting that you ask that. My first impressions with this story were just confusion, trying to figure out what all was going on
Right.
here. And I think that at first I was like, what, am I not reading this right? Why is this so confusing? But I think really that's indicative of how confusing these situations become
These
when
scenarios
you
are
take,
really
when you take the natural good of sexuality outside of the context in which God intended it and reproduction, and you try to start messing with it, things get really messy really quickly, and that's, I think, what we have here.
Right, and I guess first we should give a little bit of background on this case, because this one was really tricky. So there was a lesbian couple, and then they had some friends that were also a lesbian couple, and their friends could not conceive. They were having issues conceiving with IVF, and so they said, hey, will you be a surrogate for us? And so you have these crazy scenarios where it's like, okay, you take an egg from this person and a sperm from this person, and then you put it in a different person, you know? And so it's just this crazy convoluted kind of scenario. And of course, there was a diagnosis via ultrasound, and they found out that the baby was discovered to have Down syndrome and cystic hygroma. And so they were like, which is just like a genetic defect. They said the baby wouldn't even live. And so the friends said, hey, we just want this pregnancy terminated. Well, they had written into the contract that that would be okay. They both signed, and they were said, yeah, if there's anything like that's going to happen that's medically, we'll just go ahead and abort the baby. And everybody was cool with it. But I guess they kind of had a change of heart on the whole scenario, and they said, we don't want to do this.
Right.
And so they ended up having the baby, ended up keeping the baby. It sounds like they're no longer friends anymore. But yeah, so
it's just messy. And the one thing that I thought was interesting was that the surrogate mother, when she refused to have the abortion, her reasoning was that she had had an abortion years earlier and it was still haunting her.
Yes.
And I thought that was one other element that was particularly powerful.
Yeah.
That if this is just, this is not just a simple medical procedure. She realized that there was a baby that she was carrying, and that this baby had this diagnosis, but that this was still a human being.
Absolutely.
And so there, just that idea that there is a scar that is left by abortion. It's not just, getting your tonsils removed or something like that. I think that's powerful.
Absolutely. It's a human person. And I think that for her, I bet, thinking about it beforehand, she's like, yes, my past abortion that I've had was a traumatic experience. It wasn't a good experience. But, I'm sure the next one will be okay. It's going to be fine. But then her reasoning wasn't, I think that this abortion will go through fine and smooth, as an abortion could go. But I think she felt that life growing within her, And I think that that's what really changes people, when they know and understand that that's a life growing within them, they have that change of heart, they have that change of mind about what's going to happen.
Absolutely. And I think, as far as the messiness of this, it's important to note that in keeping this baby, the surrogate mom and her partner, they were breaking their contract. Her partner actually said, we had said we'd terminate at their request for medical reasons, but nobody ever thought we'd be in this situation. So there was an abortion clause that required them by law to abort in case of in case of a disability, because the intended moms wanted them to. So you just see the messiness. And then they initially did it because they said, oh, our friends couldn't have a baby, we wanted to help them. They're no longer friends with those people. It ruined their friendship. So you just see some of the messy things that go on here. And then there's the whole issue is, how's this baby doing? This baby was born a year ago. In theory, this diagnosis, they said, oh, she's not even going to live. How's she doing?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's such an important thing to point out, right? Doctors are not always right. I mean, I can't tell you how many cases there have been, even my life and my wife's life, that like with my wife, they were like, oh, she's going to be born mentally handicapped. You should have an abortion. They told my mother-in-law that, so thank God she didn't follow through with it. But I mean, doctors are wrong about these things. And to me, like, I've heard so many different scenarios, and this is just another case where this baby was diagnosed with something that was supposed to be horrible. The baby wasn't supposed to survive, and the baby lived. And so I think we have to remember that we have to focus on life, even if there's going to be some sort of disability that we might think will hinder us. We live in this kind of utilitarian society where it's like, oh, if we don't deem that person useful to society, then it's okay to just kill them. They're not a person anymore. But humanity isn't this objective thing,
Right. It's definitely a complicated situation. Now we have this baby with Down syndrome who was saved from abortion, thank goodness. But now she's being raised by these two other lesbian moms, and so she doesn't have a father. She's being denied the opportunity to have that relationship with a man, the father-daughter relationship.
Exactly.
So it's a confusing, messy, and unfortunate situation all around.
It is, I agree. But like you said, the good that came out of it, life.
Life, absolutely.
And I know they also set up a foundation which focuses, it's the Delaney Ott Dahl Foundation, and so it's after their last name. And so it focuses on to spreading awareness about prenatal testing, and the high quality of life of children with Down syndrome.
Right.
So children can have a nice life even if they have Down syndrome.
Absolutely.
So kind of a nice ending in part to that story. Yeah. So, all right. In our next story, a private fertility clinic in the U.S. Has launched an investigation into the health of 17 teenagers that were born as a result of a very controversial in vitro fertilization technique involving 3-parent embryos. So this is really fascinating, right? So the history on this kind of is, in the late 90s, there was this company decided to start doing this strange 3-parent in vitro fertilization. Well, not the in vitro part, but the creation of the embryo was a 3-parent technique. And so not to get too much into the science, but the basic gist of it is sometimes a mother will not be able to conceive, or they will, or to have in vitro fertilization due to these mitochondria which are in the egg. They might be, something's wrong with them, they're not working right. So what they'll do is they'll take mitochondria from a working egg, and hence the 3rd parent, and then they will inject them into that egg and then fertilize the egg and then implant it via in vitro fertilization. Or they'll fertilize it in a dish and then implant it in the womb. So what the result of that is that there's technically 3 sets of genes in there. So it's like you're kind of messing with the whole genetic. Instead of 2 parents, there's 3 parents. And so it's just this really strange scenario. So in the early 2000s, they decided FDA decided they were going to put a ban on this because they were like, well, we're not really sure of what the long-term healthcare implications of this. So fast forward to now, and they're going, well, we need to kind of follow up with this and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, and so they estimate that there were about 30 babies born through this technique before the FDA, put a stop on it in 2002. Right. So now this one U.S. fertility clinic is going to look at the results of 17 of these teenagers and say, okay, how are you doing? What's your health? And really we don't know. There had been an earlier study of babies born with mitochondria from 2 moms, and they did find some problems. A couple of the babies had a missing chromosome. They had Turner syndrome. Yes. Another one developed a pervasive developmental disorder in the first year of life, but there wasn't a big enough test group to know if those were related to that. So it's a complicated, confusing thing. I think a lot of people might look at this story and say, yeah, but it's helping a woman conceive who couldn't otherwise conceive. Isn't this a good thing?
Right, and so obviously we're all about life, right? Catholics, Christians, we should all be about life and human life, protecting it. celebrating it. But in this case, it's one of those cases where it's like the ends don't justify the means, right? You take the procreative, the unitive aspect especially out of the marital relationship, right? Children are supposed to be conceived in the act of the marital union, sex. And so you take it out, you kind of put it in this, you put it in a petri dish, in vitro, right? That's what in vitro is a petri dish. And so there's lots of different things that are wrong with this, right? Immoral about this, including that you're completely taking down and have no disregard for God's design for family, right? With these 3-parent genetic, unnatural things. I think even people that are not Christian can see how unnatural this is and have issues with this.
Absolutely, and I think it's important whenever we address these topics involving trying to deal with infertility, we have to have just the awareness and the sensitivity to realize this is something that's very difficult for people. For
Absolutely.
Couples who can't conceive, this is very, very difficult. It's very painful. And so when we address them about this, a lot of people also just were never taught. This is an area of church teaching that some people just had never had it explained to them. So I think in addressing this, there needs to be a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding.
Absolutely.
And a lot of realization of how difficult this is for people.
I mean, I knew for a long time growing up that I wanted to have a family and have kids, and I can't imagine what it would be like to find out that I can't have kids. So I just feel so bad for people that discover that they cannot have kids naturally. And you're right, a lot of compassion is needed. So
Absolutely. Coming up after the break, we'll speak with an expert on moral questions involving end-of-life care.
Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
For this segment, we have a special guest joining us, Troy Friedman, who's a physician assistant at St. Anthony's Medical Center here in Colorado. Welcome, Troy.
Thanks.
The story that we're going to be discussing with Troy today involves end-of-life counseling sessions, which have been controversial for years. As early as next year, however, they may soon be covered for Americans on Medicare. So, Troy, our first question to you, are end-of-life counseling sessions always a bad thing, or are they something that is sometimes okay, but there are concerns surrounding it?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely not. They are not always a bad thing. In fact, I think they're a very good thing. I think the church would recommend that you do end-of-life planning, and having those conversations are important. Those conversations can include making decisions and making your desires very clear to your family, your caregivers. Things like having access to the sacraments, who you want to be present, at your death, what sorts of treatments you might elect to have. For example, if a person has terminal cancer and they are not actively pursuing a cure for that cancer, it doesn't exclude the possibility that they might receive IV antibiotics for an infective pneumonia, for example. So as a palliative measure. So these are the sorts of decisions that I think it's very good and healthy and takes a lot of stress off your family if they're made ahead of time.
Right, exactly. I think that the subject itself, I think, is very good. It's something that you want. People worry about the end of their life, and they need specific things to be set out so that there's not these, oh, we didn't think about this scenario or this situation, and what would dad or mom want, or what would I want for for my family. I think there are good things about it. But how do you think that these counseling sessions that are going on will affect potentially, assisted suicide and things like that?
So this is tricky because I've had a lot of patients who come back after hospitalizations, and a social worker or a hospital chaplain has sat down with them with one of these sort of end of life documents, and helped them to fill it out, and it comes back and it's like decline, everything, and it's just ready for my signature. And my first question to these people, first of all, is, have you ever been really, really, really thirsty? And my second question is that how you want to feel at the end of your life? And I don't think people really consider. They just think, oh, well, I'll be dying, I won't be experiencing anything, and that's not really the case. It's important to remember that there's a grand architect of the culture of death, and that this culture of death is bent on devaluing the human person. And I think this is the way that the culture of death kind of touches on the ill and the elderly, is to sort of get into this area. And I don't think the issue of assisted suicide is maybe as imminent as the issue of unassisted suicide. Getting our elderly, our grandmas and grandpas, and the people that are sick or have terminal illnesses to agree to refuse care. And so it's not this active participation on, in terms of the healthcare provider's role, but this passive neglect that ultimately leads to a hastening of their death.
Troy, just last week, the World Health Organization released a report saying that every 40 seconds, someone commits suicide. And one thing that I thought was surprising was that the heaviest toll was not young people, not teenagers, it was the elderly. What's your response to that?
I have this colleague who likes to come in periodically, and he's got a question ready for me. And recently he came in and he asked me a question related to this, and he said, how, where does the church get off making decisions for people? How can they tell them what to decide, and whether or not they can accept nutrition or hydration, and especially like, how can the church tell them that they don't have the right to die if they want to? And I asked him, I said, well, if you had a patient come in right now that came in through the urgent care and said to you, I want to kill myself and I'm going to commit suicide, I said, what is your response to that? What are you obligated to respond to that with? And he kind of smiled at me and he said, I would put that person on a 72-hour mental health hold, and I would forcibly hospitalize them if necessary. And I said, exactly, because we assume that people who want to die aren't in a mentally healthy state. And so I think the disturbing thing here is that at a time where people in the aging population need our support and our affirmation, and they need to be told that they have dignity and that they have value and purpose, and they need to be helped to kind of finish strong at the end of their life, we're kind of taking more of a utilitarian approach and just telling them that you're a burden on the taxpayer, you're a burden on the healthcare system, you're a burden on your family, and nobody feels like they want to be a burden, and so they'll
I agree with you. I think that's really where it goes, is like this view of, oh, you're not important. It's kind of tied to all these different things like abortion, and the elderly and the people that are mentally disabled and things like that. Oh, you're not useful, so you should just die. And so what does the church teach regarding these end-of-life scenarios, and what sort of requirements to sustain life, are there, et cetera?
I think a really easy thing to remember is that breakfast is never extraordinary. So food and water, those are just standard of care. Everybody deserves to be hydrated and to eat.
Right.
So you can never refuse those, not for yourself and not for anyone else. Extraordinary means of keeping you alive. You have a terminal illness, you're unable to breathe on your own. Turning off a machine is not an immoral thing, provided that your healthcare provider doesn't see the possibility that you may have a full recovery. Now, if you have the possibility of having a full recovery,